And welcome to part one of today's two-part webinar series. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. And looking at the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel, please note also that a copy of today's presentation is available for reference. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Ron Eck. Hello.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you. And everyone, thank you for coming, attending today. Good morning for this part one of ADA in work zones is my short title for the session. So why don't we get started? As Mike said, I'm Ron Eck. I'm a civil engineer with the West Virginia LTAP program. I'm in Morgantown, West Virginia this morning, which is where the LTAP is based. I've been involved in ADA accessibility related training and activities probably for over 25 years. This course is an outgrowth of that involvement. There is my email address on the screen. Feel free to make a note of that, and if questions or concerns come up after the session today or sessions today, feel free to reach out by email. I'm always glad to try to respond. Here's our agenda for today. Of course, we're in line for an hour and a half this morning and then an hour and a half this afternoon. We'll look at a brief background and introduction to the topic. Then we'll talk about the basics of the Pedestrian Access Route, or the PAR as I call it, which outlines the requirements of an accessible facility, accessible route. Then we'll talk about approaches to routing pedestrians in sidewalk or on sidewalk work zones. We'll talk a little bit about accessible and detectable temporary paths and the various devices or techniques that can be achieved, that can be used to achieve the accessibility and detectability. Then towards the end this afternoon, we'll look at some best practices, kind of a summary of what we've talked about up to that point. And then we'll talk about assessing some actual temporary traffic control installations as time permits. I do have two case studies I've included. Hopefully we'll have time for those. And in addition, hopefully we'll have time for a few other installations that we'll look at. But that's our agenda for today. Here's what I hope you'll get out of the sessions this morning and this afternoon. I hope by the time we're done this afternoon, you'll be able to recognize the difficulties that pedestrians with no or limited vision or with mobility limitations encounter in sidewalk work zones. I hope you'll be able to explain the guidelines and regulations that govern accessible temporary traffic control. And really there's two. There's PROWAG, the Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, and there's the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And we'll talk more about the specifics in each of those documents as we go through the session. I hope you'll be able to integrate pedestrian needs and relevant criteria into the design of safe and accessible temporary traffic control. Again, we're talking about sidewalk work zones. I hope you'll be able to assess a temporary traffic control setup for safety, accessibility, and detectability. And I mean this for, I'll call it two types of setups. One, for an actual setup, say on the sidewalk or on the streets of some entity, an actual setup, but also I hope you'll be able to assess, for example, a set of plans that addresses sidewalk work zones and make sure that the work zones that's being designed or planned provides for safe, accessible, and detectable travel for pedestrians. And then I realize some of you, maybe not everybody, but some of you actually deploy or implement work zone traffic control on sidewalks. So I hope you'll be able to select and deploy detectable and compliant devices and ramps for an accessible pathway or sidewalk closure. So those are the things I hope you'll get out of the session today. A little bit more in the way of background. What we're talking about today really kind of originates with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It was signed into law back in July of 1990, so this year will be the 36th anniversary of ADA. It was signed into law by President H.W. Bush. It's a civil rights law, so it's a little different type of law than maybe we in public works are used to dealing with. But the idea is, the aim is to provide equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities so they can access the same programs, services, and facilities as any other pedestrian. The United States Department of Justice has ultimate compliance responsibility when it comes to ADA. And kind of the bottom line is, as you see in the last bullet there, all programs and new and altered facilities, regardless of the funding source, must be accessible if they're in the public right of way. And notice I've highlighted the word altered, because I would argue that when there's a sidewalk work zone, for whatever purpose, it might even be for building maintenance or for landscaping, but if it affects the movement of pedestrians on that sidewalk, we've altered that facility, excuse me, temporarily. But notice the requirement is that that altered facility must be accessible until the kind of the permanent facility is restored to use. Obviously, ADA is pretty comprehensive. Our focus today is going to be on Title II of ADA, which relates to state and local governments. Probably, I've not seen the roster for class, but I think it's fair to say everyone attending today is probably with a state or local government, or with, if you're with the private sector, a consultant or a contractor, you do work for and with state and local government. So I believe that's probably the interest of everyone that's here today, is the state and local government side of ADA. But even Title II, you can see, has many different subparts, talks about a lot of different topics. Our focus is going to be on subpart D, which deals with program accessibility. And one thing I'll note, excuse me, when you see the word program in ADA, that includes sidewalks and infrastructure. So program in ADA includes sidewalk and infrastructure. And subpart E, which deals with communications. So this is, we're going to focus on these two subparts of Title II. What does subpart D say? Notice it's titled New Construction and Alterations. Each facility altered by, on behalf of, or for the use of a public entity shall, notice the word shall there, so this is not just a nice thing to do, it's a requirement, shall to the maximum extent feasible be altered in such a manner that the altered portion of the facility is readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. And again, that's kind of the bottom line, that public agencies, their facilities, whether it's a permanent facility or an altered facility, like a work zone, those facilities must be readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. Subpart E deals with communications, and it says a public entity shall, there's that word shall again, shall take appropriate steps to ensure that communications with basically members of the public with disabilities are as effective as communications with others. And we'll talk about how to do that as we go through the session here this morning and this afternoon. Introduce a few terms we'll probably talk about. One is the Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines, or ADAG. They're also referred to as the 2010 ADA Design Standards. This is the law, a law when it comes to ADA. The key thing is, though, ADAG is intended for buildings and on-site facilities. And Of course, public works agencies, state DOTs, they have buildings and on-site facilities in addition to the public right-of-way. And so that's what ADAG applies to. It does not address many of the issues in the public right-of-way. For example, ADAG does not talk about roundabouts. ADAG does not talk about crosswalks. ADAG does not talk about traffic signals, for example. Those topics are covered in PROWAG, the Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, which is a standalone document intended to provide accessibility standards specifically for the public right-of-way. So streets, sidewalks, crosswalks, traffic signals, roundabouts, on-street parking, all of those things are covered in PROWAG. It's applicable to new construction and alterations of existing facilities. As many of you are probably aware, PROWAG was in draft form for probably a couple decades. The final rule was issued in August of 2023, but we're not quite done yet. We have the final rule, but the final rule can't be enforced until the US DOT and the US DOJ adopt PROWAG, and they're in the process of doing that, but I don't want to speculate when that might happen. But still remember, even though it's not enforced, even though PROWAG is not enforceable, general ADA is enforceable. And remember that bottom line statement I mentioned a few times. Public agencies need to make sure their facilities are readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. That still is enforceable. And the best way to show you're doing that is to follow PROWAG. In Chapter 2, Section R201 of PROWAG, they do address temporary traffic control. Notice the first bullet there is from R201.2. The requirements in these guidelines, meaning PROWAG, shall apply, there's that word shall again, shall apply to temporary and permanent pedestrian facilities and elements in the public right-of-way. Where a pedestrian circulation path is temporarily closed by construction, maintenance, operations, or similar conditions, an alternate pedestrian access route shall be provided. So there's that word shall again. So it's a requirement that when a sidewalk is temporarily closed by the various reasons mentioned here, or it could be landscaping or building maintenance or whatever it might be, there needs to be an alternate pedestrian access route. Many of you, of course, are probably familiar and have been with the manual and uniform traffic control devices. The quote here comes from the 11th edition, 2023 edition, but actually this has been in the manual for a number of different versions. Notice right up front in Part 6, Section 6A.01, the needs and control of all road users. And in there, they also say, including pedestrians with disabilities, through a temporary traffic control zone shall be an essential part of highway construction, utility work, maintenance operations. So again, it's not just a nice thing to do. The MUTCD also requires that we make sure we can accommodate and provide accessible, detectable facilities for individuals with disabilities. Here's a temporary traffic control area. Actually, I took this a few years ago here in Morgantown, West Virginia, where I live. Actually, it's kind of in my neighborhood. I live literally a stone's throw from this location. And let me get my cursor here. The city of Morgantown was planning to resurface the street you see in the foreground here, running from left to right. They're going to resurface this street later that summer. And to their credit, they realized that when you resurface a street, you need to bring the curb ramps into compliance with the current criteria. So even before construction started, you can see they are working on the curb ramps, on the curb ramp at this particular corner. But is this work area detectable? Can it be detected by an individual, a blind individual, using a long cane? And the answer is no. Number one, that you can see the yellow caution tape here, but it's pretty high up. Person would run into the tape before they detect it. But number two, and maybe more significantly, is this tape is not a detectable edge, or it cannot be detected by a cane. And so this work zone is not detectable. Is there an alternate pedestrian access route? I think you can see, obviously, there is no, at least to me, no immediately visible alternate pedestrian access route. And this particular location actually is a challenging one, right? Because notice there's no sidewalk on the other side of the street. One way to handle this would just be to detour pedestrians to the other side of the street. But here we don't have a sidewalk on the other side of the street. So we'd actually have to look at more of the neighborhood or the block that you see there on the right to figure out how to handle this. But the point is, this is neither a detectable nor accessible temporary traffic control, sidewalk temporary traffic control setup. Well, where do these requirements I've been referring to and that we'll talk about, where do they apply? They basically apply to all temporary traffic control zones that might be set up by state and local road agencies, construction, maintenance contractors, both road construction and vertical or building construction. They apply to utility companies, landscaping companies. If they're working on the sidewalk, affecting the use of the sidewalk, these requirements apply to them as well. Some examples of closing a sidewalk for utility work or to repair the sidewalk. Maybe you're just doing building maintenance. Maybe it's not even a public works or a road project, but the owner of a building needs to do some work. Maybe bricks are popping out of the facade or something, and so they have to close the sidewalk for some period of time, maybe while a contractor comes in and does building maintenance or repair. Or like I say, a downtown storefront alteration that next to the public right of way. Or it could be a big project, a major project, where maybe you're building a new hotel downtown and you have to close the sidewalk for many months while that project takes place. That also falls within the scope of what we're talking about. I've been mentioning the terms accessible and detectable, so probably I should define what those are. So let's spend a minute or two looking at that. When I say accessible, I mean an alternate pedestrian pathway through a sidewalk work zone that pedestrians can safely reach, enter, and travel through to the end of the work zone. So that implies having curb ramps so pedestrians can move between the sidewalk and the street, adequate turning spaces or landings so they can turn onto or off of a ramp, and surfaces need to be smooth, stable, and slip resistant. And so here I encourage you, here you see a sidewalk work zone. The back here end here is not really a good sidewalk closure, so don't worry about that. We'll talk about sidewalk closures, but the point I wanted to mention is notice the detour here is the pedestrians cross the street on the right here and then use the other side of the street. So this sidewalk is wide enough, it's firm, stable, slip resistant. There's plenty of room, the landing here, to turn onto the curb ramp, and they can enter, pedestrians can enter the street. So that path that I just described would be an accessible path. The other term I keep using is detectable. And detectable means a traffic control device or a device placed within a temporary pedestrian pathway that has a continuous edge. So pedestrians with vision impairments can follow that continuous edge either by their hand or by a assistive device, notably the long cane they can follow that to the end of the pathway. So notice here, this is a static photo, but this individual is blind. And if we had a video, we'd see that she's swinging that cane in an arc in front of her, and she's looking for detectable edges. So this wall here, let's call it our high curb, this is a detectable surface. This is an edge. She can detect that surface and follow that in what they call a shoreline. That's a shoreline for a blind pedestrian. And so that's a good thing to have detectable edges. Here are some examples we might look at. Actually here, this sidewalk on the right side of the slide was beyond this sign was actually closed for much of the summer while the sidewalk was being rebuilt. Actually now the work, you can see the sidewalk work has been completed and the sidewalk is reopened. So really there's no need for that detour signage. But anyway, my question is this a detectable work area? Sidewalk work zone is an accessible sidewalk work zone. Well, remember I talked about subpart E, communications. We have the sign here to alert pedestrians. It looks like what they did was put in a temporary crosswalk in the middle of the block here. And so pedestrians were to cross the street here and then use the other side of the street for maybe a block or two until they could go back to the original side of the street. The problem with this sign, which that's a standard sign from the MUTCD, but the problem with that is that does not communicate with the visually impaired. A blind pedestrian cannot see that sign. So if we're going to close a sidewalk, there needs to be a detectable barricade across the sidewalk so that the pedestrian, the visually impaired pedestrian, can detect that the sidewalk is closed. So this is not a detectable path, alternate path for pedestrians. If we look, is it accessible? If we look closely, it looks like there's a curb here. Also, if you look closely, it looks like there's bare earth between the sidewalk and the street. Eventually, this will, of course, become a grass strip. But right now it looks like bare earth, and bare earth is not an accessible surface. It could be muddy, could be soft, and so bare earth is not an accessible surface. So there's not an accessible route to the street. Also, it looks like there's a curb there, so there's no way for someone in a wheelchair to get into the street. There needs to be a curb ramp there. Even if it's just a temporary ramp, there needs to be a ramp to get pedestrians to and from the street. So unfortunately, this work area, work zone, is not detectable nor accessible. How about this one? I took this in Minneapolis a few years ago. I was there for a conference. Just all the signage and devices struck me. You can see there's traffic control devices for motor vehicles. There's also devices and signing for pedestrians. Notice the sign says the sidewalk's closed, but is that a detectable message or barricade? No, it's not. Again, a blind pedestrian can't read that message. And if they're relying on their cane, I would argue they could find a path through here beyond that sign, which they can't see or detect. So this is not detectable. And if we look closely, you can see that this looked to be the main access route to the job site. So vehicles and equipment would use that kind of driveway. You can see it looks like there was a water pipe in the gutter here, and to allow vehicles to pass over that pipe, they put in some pea gravel. But pea gravel and wheelchairs don't really mix. The wheels of a manual wheelchair would probably quickly bog down in that pea gravel. So this is not accessible either. Someone in a wheelchair could not get through that path there. So really what they should have done here, again, this is neither detectable nor accessible. They probably, excuse me, probably should have closed this sidewalk at the beginning of the block to just keep pedestrians out of this area and maybe detour them to the other side of the street. Although in this case, I'm not sure there's an accessible route on the other side of the street either. I took this about a year ago in Washington, D.C. I was there for a conference. This was kind of a busy sidewalk. The Washington, D.C. Convention Center is behind this building here. And so this is a major route used by pedestrians to travel between the convention center and hotels and restaurants. You can see it's an office building for some professional society, but I think you can see from some of the signage and such that there's a pharmacy here on the first floor, and it looked like they were replacing a window pane at the pharmacy. And so you can see what the contractor did in terms of traffic control. Is that detectable? Not in my opinion. I mean, I jokingly say sometimes it looks like a yard sale. I mean, there's all kinds of containers of different materials and then a cone or two or three. But think about it, if you're walking with a cane looking for a detectable edge or trying to figure out what's going on, I think that would be very difficult here. In fact, it would be possible to get into the work area for any pedestrian, given the large openings here. And I guess there is a container here, but not very visible. Is it accessible? Well, what they should have done here is put in a detectable edge, probably from maybe this corner of the building here to the corner of this the fence here, to prevent pedestrians from getting into that area, which makes it seem like it's not accessible. But one thing you can't see is to the left here of these trees, there is along the curb about a 5-foot wide strip of sidewalk to serve, I guess, maybe the parking meters and things that are along the street, the on-street parking. So actually this is accessible. It's just a matter of providing some cues, providing information to pedestrians so they can find that sidewalk here on the other side of these trees. And then one more, this is in Wisconsin a few years ago. Notice, and I don't know the whole story, but I was here about a half an hour talking with someone, and a crew came in, 3-person crew. You can see they removed the manhole cover. 2 of the crew members went down below grade. They installed some traffic control here. And in fairness, for like 90% of the time I was there, the 3rd crew member was kind of standing here. I guess both us being able to assist those below the surface, but also serving as a spotter or providing warning for pedestrians in the area. But then I turned around and looked, and for a few minutes he disappeared. So obviously this is not really a good situation with an open manhole here and nobody sort of standing watch there. But in terms of traffic control, they did put some, this is a detectable barricade. Personally, I'd move it farther away from the opening to provide, you know, some distance separation there, but at least they do have a detectable barricade. And with a person there, that individual could communicate with people with mobility impairments or vision impairments and direct them properly through this area, because there is, this looks like it's more than 5 feet here, there is an accessible route around this work area. So I would say this is somewhat detectable. I'd maybe want to do it a little differently, but it is detectable and it is accessible because there is a path around that work area. Why is all this important? Well, everybody benefits, not only individuals with disabilities, but really all pedestrians benefit from these accessibility features we're talking about. Considering birth to death, meaning someone's whole lifespan, the United States has about a 10.5% disability population. So about 1 out of every 10 Americans has some sort of a disability. People have temporary disabilities, maybe due to surgery or injuries they have sustained. And maybe some of you have been in that situation. Maybe temporarily you had to use a walker or a wheelchair or crutches or something like that. Also, complying and having accessible features encourages visitors, promotes economic development, but also it is the law. And if agencies don't comply, they can be exposed to civil rights lawsuits. But there's also safety implications, as we'll talk about throughout the day today. And if people are injured through falls or other, maybe they strike something, they may file tort liability claims against public agencies seeking compensation for their injuries. So there can be sort of a double whammy in terms of exposure to lawsuits or claims. Just briefly mention some of the characteristics of pedestrians. We're going to look at three main categories: mobility impairments, vision impairments, and then cognitive impairments. People with mobility impairments may have limited agility, speed, endurance, maybe balance issues, and so they need firm, stable, slip-resistant surfaces that are wide enough for themselves and their assistive device. They need curb ramps to move between the sidewalk and the street, and they benefit from limited cross slope. Cross slope, of course, is the slope at right angles to the direction of pedestrian travel. People with mobility impairments face movement barriers, which really is anything that restricts a person's ability to move or progress along an environment or within an environment. And here you see this wheelchair, and this is a staged situation, but notice at the base of this ramp here, base of ramps should be flush, no more than a 1/4 inch vertical lip. But this is about 2-inch lip, and as I said, this was staged. The wheelchair, small front wheels struck this lip, came to a stop, and had someone been in a wheelchair and moving at significant speed, they might actually have been pitched or catapulted from the wheelchair onto the sidewalk. So that lip at the base of this ramp, I would call that a movement barrier. People with vision disabilities get their information from sounds, textures, and contrast. I should have mentioned not everyone is legally blind. Another category of vision impairment are the low vision pedestrians, and they can see colors and contrasts. They just don't see detail very well, or maybe not see detail at all. So for people with low vision, contrast can be important. In the photo here, we see this is an accessible pedestrian signal, and actually we can't appreciate the key feature of it from the photo, and that is that it has audible tones. There's a locator tone that sounds 24/7 to let the visually impaired know that there is a push button at the corner, and they can home in on that sound and find the push button. And then after they push the push button, at some point the walk indication will come on, and that will be a more rapid tone to let them know that it's okay to cross the street. But notice on the device here, here's the push button, of course, but notice this raised arrow. This is called a tactile arrow. It can be felt by the fingertips of a visually impaired pedestrian. It's lined up with and in the direction of the crosswalk. And so that's an assistive technology to help them cross the street. But notice kind of superimposed on that is this bold white arrow. And notice the contrast with the dark background. That bold white arrow that's kind of painted on there, that is really for the benefit of the low vision pedestrians who can detect contrast, they just can't see details. People who have vision impairments experience information barriers, which is anything really that restricts the ability to use information contained in the street and sidewalk environment. And notice here we have a sidewalk work zone. In fact, it looks like a building project, doesn't it? It's probably not a public works or street project. It looks like some sort of building reconstruction or maintenance or something, doing something to the building. But anyway, they've got much of the sidewalk closed. And here's this yellow caution tape again. I mentioned previously, this is not a detectable surface. Person using a cane walking into this image would, and the way they'd know that a work zone is occurring there is when this tape, rubs across their chest, but because they can't detect it with their cane. Really, what should have been done here is, I'm not sure if that's one or multiple sheets of plywood, but if it's multiple sheets, you could just simply put those sheets of plywood here to create a detectable barricade, and the blind pedestrian would go to their right or their left until they found a path around it. And to the credit of whoever set this up, they didn't set it up properly in terms of detectability or closing the sidewalk, but you can see they did provide or attempted to provide an alternate pedestrian access route. And then the third category of impairments are individuals with cognitive disabilities. This affects information processing and decision making. And this category of disabilities, and cognitive disabilities include things like individuals who have suffered traumatic brain injuries, that's a cognitive disability, or autism. And of course, there's different levels of severity of autism, but autism would be considered a cognitive disability. This, because there are such a wide variety and different levels of severity, it can be challenging to accommodate individuals with cognitive impairments. But you can see there just some general things that where possible, we should try to keep that in mind when we're designing the built environment, not only work zones, but we should also try to follow those kind of principles in temporary traffic control as well. What are some of the challenges faced by pedestrians with disabilities in work zones? And again, we're going to focus mainly on those people with vision impairments and then those with mobility impairments. And remember, individuals with mobility impairments will be using generally some type of assistive device. It could be a wheelchair, it could be walker, crutches, a cane, those kinds of things. What about a blind pedestrian when they encounter a sidewalk work zone? Well, they really don't know the temporary traffic control is there until they reach it. Even though there may be signing up, they can't see that. And so communicating with them, with the visually impaired, about a sidewalk situation is important. They don't know, is there a safe alternative way to proceed, or do they have to kind of go back and recalculate their trip? And if they do attempt to cross the street and walk on the other side of the street, what's involved with that? What are the traffic conflicts? They don't know those things. And can a cane provide a safe way to continue through the detour? Remember, if you're using a cane, they need to rely on detectable edges, those shorelines I talked about, and those might not always be present. In terms of a person, say, in a wheelchair or using a walker, they may face temporary ramps that are too steep or kind of flimsy construction, so they may wobble when the person gets on the ramp with their device. There may not be side guards to prevent the wheels from dropping off the edge. The landing or the turning area may not be wide enough for their device, so they may not be able to turn. And the surfaces may not be firm and stable, or there may be lips, like I mentioned at the base of that curb ramp I showed earlier. Those things are all barriers to movement for people with mobility impairments or using assistive devices. So that was kind of the introduction or background. I'd be glad to answer any questions. Mike, I don't know if any questions have come in yet to this point. We haven't really gotten into the technical aspects of the topic, but I'll break short or momentarily here to see if there are any questions.
All right. Thanks, Ron. As a reminder to our audience, the questions box is available. And Ron, we do have one question from William. He says, quote, how can a city propose an alternative pedestrian pathway during a bridge reconstruction project with no vehicle or pedestrian access, end quote?
Great question, William. And I'm not trying to be a smart aleck or anything, but really the response is going to depend on the specific situation. In other words, like what's the length of the detour with the bridge out? How long what's the duration of the project? Is it months or a year or more than a year? Those kind of questions. But so you have to look at kind of the environment. Where's the nearest sort of existing crossing that folks could use? How far is that detour? What sort of area are you talking about? And let me give an example to show maybe what needs to be considered, because accessibility does need to be provided, but it's going to depend on the specific situation. I'm aware a few years ago there was a major bridge project in a large city in the south. I think the bridge was going to be out for a couple years. The nearest detour was the nearest structure, a bridge structure, I guess, that could be used as a detour was probably a mile away. And originally, I think the road agency, as I understand it, I wasn't involved in the project, but as I understood it, the road agency basically said we just can't feasibly put in an alternate route for pedestrians. But of course, as part of this was a major project, so they were holding public meetings and such. And on one side of where the bridge had been and where the bridge will be in a couple years was a high-rise senior housing facility. And on the other side of the bridge was a pharmacy. And it became evident at the public meetings that the senior citizens who lived in the high-rise senior housing facility, they said, we rely on that pharmacy not only for our medications, but for things in our daily lives that we need, including food. We can't be cut off from that destination, that store, for 2 years. And the road agency realized that was an issue. And so what they did was, I think 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, from maybe 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., the road agency sponsored a shuttle van that ran on the road system between the senior housing and the pharmacy. So, it wasn't available all the time. If somebody had a need on a weekend, they were going to have to wait till Monday morning, but at least they attempted to provide accessibility to the extent practicable to do so. So you sort of have to look at your situation. In this case, there were important destinations on each side of that bridge structure, and the road agency felt the need to provide, in this case, a shuttle van service rather than provide sort of on the ground pedestrian route. But again, you're going to have to, others may be facing that question. You really need to look at your specific situation. There is no one size fits all for those types of questions, but good question. Thanks for asking that.
Thanks, Ron. We have a question from Stephen. He says, quote, does the alternate PAR need to be compliant or only compliant to the same level as the pre-construction route, end quote?
In my opinion, it should be compliant. It needs to be compliant with the PROWAG and MUTCD requirements. And we'll talk about that in more detail as we go through here.
Thanks, Ron. Question from Greg. He says, are all barricades to be 2 inches above the ground maximum?
Generally, yes, but we'll talk about that again too in more detail. But I would say in general, yes.
Thanks, Ron. Question from Jason, quote, does the ADA temporary facilities requirement only apply if there were existing facilities? What if no pedestrian facilities existed prior to the construction? Then temp pedestrian facilities are not required, question mark. Jason from County of Santa Clara.
Great question, and can I delay that for a few minutes? We'll talk about that here in the morning session. And if I don't address your issue, then please holler at me again, but we'll talk about that here shortly.
All right, thanks, Ron. Those are the questions for now.
Okay, thanks. Thanks everyone for the good questions. We've mentioned the PAR, the Pedestrian Access Route. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the basics of the PAR. I realize for many of you, this may be a repeat. You're probably familiar with this, but I also appreciate that we may have folks here who have no knowledge of the PAR, so I want to make sure we all are on the same page when it comes to accessibility. So this is going to be a quick overview of the basics of the Pedestrian Access Route. And these are the items that need to be considered when we're talking about an accessible route. You can see width, grade, cross slope, surfaces, and those are all in Chapter 3 of PROWAG. But we also need to be attentive to what are called protruding objects, and these are discussed in Chapter 4 of PROWAG. So width, and these are the PROWAG requirements. I realize some agencies go above and beyond PROWAG, and that's fine, continue to do that. But this session is based on PROWAG, so we'll talk about the PROWAG minimums. Under PROWAG, the continuous clear width of a pedestrian access route shall be, there's that word shall again, 48 inches minimum, exclusive of the width of any curb. So it's measured from the back of the curb. In ADAG, remember ADAG's for buildings and sites, in ADAG, the minimum width is 3 feet. So a wheelchair can actually get through a 3 foot wide opening, as you see here. It's kind of a tight squeeze, but it can be done. In PROWAG, the minimum, as I just said, is 4 feet, and that's because in PROWAG, the design user is an individual on crutches. And if we measured from crutch tip to crutch tip here, this would probably be about 3.5 feet. And so PROWAG uses a minimum width of 4 feet versus 3 feet in ADAG. And I appreciate that that can get confusing. PROWAG also says that if your walkway width is less than 5 feet, there needs to be 5 foot by 5 foot passing spaces at intervals of 200 feet maximum. And I mentioned protruding objects. This comes from Chapter 4 of PROWAG. A protruding object is something that protrudes more than 4 inches into the pedestrian circulation path at a height above 27 inches, but less than 80 inches. For example, this fire department connection you can see here sticking out of this chain link fence. That's more than 4 inches into the pedestrian circulation path. Its height is above 27 inches, and that number comes from cane detection. That's called cane detection height. If something is 27 inches high or lower, it can be detected by the cane tip before the pedestrian contacts it. If it's higher than 27 inches, it won't be picked up by the cane tip, and the person will walk into it before they're aware of it. And then the upper level here, 80 inches, that's just the standard height of a door in building construction. So anything that extends more than 4 inches into this zone bordered by the red dashed lines here at a height greater than 27 inches, less than 80, is a protruding object, which is a safety issue for all pedestrians, but especially for the visually impaired who can't see that feature and may run into it. The notice here on the right, this could be, let's imagine this is a trash receptacle mounted on the wall of a building. Notice the top of it is above 27 inches, but the bottom is below 27 inches. So this is a detectable feature, so it's not a protruding object. Maybe this is a lamp or something here, a light or a sign. It protrudes more than 4 inches into the pedestrian circulation path, but you see it's at a height of above 80 inches, so it's not considered a protruding object. There are a variety of protruding objects in the built environment, and we need to be aware of those things like tree limbs, guy wires like you see on the right here, signs, all sorts of features. This is a blow up of the alternate access route I showed earlier. It is an alternate access route, but if you look closely, you can see on the scaffold and some of the details here, these metal members protrude more than 4 inches into the walkway at a height above 27 inches. So these are potential protruding objects that a visually impaired pedestrian could run into and be injured. Another element of the PAR is the cross slope of the walkway, and PROWAG says the cross slope of a pedestrian access route not contained within a crosswalk shall be 1 to 48 or 2.1% maximum. And this can be a challenge, but the reason for that is for the individual in the manual wheelchair. Cross slope really affects their ability to maneuver efficiently in the built environment. If it's a steep cross slope, it makes it difficult for them to maintain a straight line path. And I think we've just talked about that. So what are some cross slope solutions? I mentioned the pedestrian circulation path. The pedestrian circulation path is measured from the back of curb to the back of the sidewalk. So notice here we have a relatively wide pedestrian circulation path. The PAR only needs to be 4 or 5 feet wide. So in this case, we can put our PAR within the pedestrian circulation path. So notice the entire pedestrian circulation path doesn't have to have a cross slope of 2%, just the PAR portion of it does. Walkway grade. Where the PAR is contained within the highway right-of-way, the grade of the PAR shall not exceed 5%. That's what PROWAG says. In fact, that's what ADAG says as well for grade. But there's an important exception in PROWAG. Where the grade established for the adjacent street exceeds 5%, the grade of the PAR shall not exceed the grade established for the adjacent street. So if sidewalks follow the street, or I like to say if the sidewalks serve the street, they can follow the same grade as the street grade, even if that's well in excess of 5%. But where a PAR is not contained within the highway right-of-way, then the grade of the PAR shall not exceed 5%. And also keep in mind that where a PAR is contained within a crosswalk, and crosswalks are part of the PAR, the grade of the PAR shall be 5% maximum. So that means the maximum cross slope of a street is 5%. Running slopes, of course, present challenges. Trying to go uphill, it requires a lot of energy, exertion, but probably the truth is the downhill is probably the more difficult, because people who use wheelchairs, walkers, canes, crutches, going downhill presents stability and control problems and concerns. Another major cross slope challenge is driveways. Notice here, this sidewalk crosses the driveway. So for that, the width of the driveway, the cross slope of the sidewalk is the same as the grade of the driveway, which probably exceeds 2%. Also notice the grade breaks on each, or flares on each side of the driveway. And I realize this is a cartoon depiction, but it's technically accurate. Notice in negotiating this driveway flare here, the small front wheel of this wheelchair is off the ground, and that is an undesirable situation. We want our designs to be such that at all times, all four wheels of the manual wheelchair are off the ground, or I should say on the ground. All four wheels are on the ground. So this is not a good situation from a safety standpoint. Surfaces. PROWAG is pretty generic. It says surfaces must be firm, stable, slip resistant. They should be smooth. So things like concrete, asphalt, those are accessible surfaces. Timber, like a timber boardwalk, it's firm, stable. When it's wet, it might not be slip resistant, so you may need to do some treatments to provide slip resistance. Same way with like metal. We could have a metal bridge structure or something like that on the sidewalk. It's firm and stable, but we may need to do something to provide adequate slip resistance. So things like I mentioned earlier, bare earth, grass, mulch, stone, those are not considered accessible surfaces because they are not always firm and stable. PROWAG also talks about in the PAR changes in level or vertical surface discontinuities. They shall not exceed a 1/4 inch maximum. Those between a 1/4 and a 1/2 inch need to be beveled with a slope not steeper than 50%, beveled across the entire vertical surface discontinuity. If these changes in level are not addressed, they can be tripping hazards like the one on the left there. But that one seen on the left is also inaccessible to wheelchair users. A wheelchair user probably may have to pop a wheelie to get up over that lip, and not everybody has the ability to do that. So I like to call this situation here on the left, this can be a potential double whammy for municipalities. It's potentially an ADA lawsuit because it's an inaccessible sidewalk due to that change in level, but it's also a tripping hazard. And if an able-bodied pedestrian trips and falls and is injured, they may file a tort claim against the agency. So that's why I call these locations potential double whammies. PROWAG says changes in level greater than a 1/2 inch up to 6 inches shall have an 8.3% maximum slope. And here's kind of, it looks like some construction's going on. So we have some temporary traffic control. And here's what this particular, I guess the contractor did. They attempted to ramp over the hose here. It's hard to tell. It looks like that may probably 6 inches, so it should be an 8.3% maximum slope. That looks much steeper than 8.3%, so it doesn't comply in that regard. I think it would be impossible for someone in a wheelchair or maybe even with a walker to get over that. But also for all pedestrians, able-bodied might be able to step on that. But notice it looks like it's just kind of normal enamel paint. And I imagine when that surface gets wet, it probably gets pretty slippery. So I also have not only accessibility, but also safety concerns with this setup as well. And then we need to be attentive to horizontal openings like joints and grates and things like that. They should not allow passage of a sphere larger than a 1/2 inch in diameter. That's what PROWAG says. Notice here the small front wheel of that wheelchair dropped into that grate. The wheelchair can actually get stuck there, or also it probably stopped suddenly and could catapult the individual in the chair onto the sidewalk. Also, elongated openings, like you see with this grade here, could place those so that the long dimension is perpendicular to the main direction of travel. But I think you can see, even regardless of how it's placed, someone's crutch tip or cane tip, even if it doesn't drop through that opening, it's the bearing and stability of that assistive device is affected by the grading. How about this pedestrian access route? Took this a few years ago. I think that the setup, the work zone setup is not completed yet, at least I hope not, because it looked like people could get behind it here into this metal work, which again is a safety issue. So I hope when the job is done, and actually it should have been done, since I took this in the evening, should have been done probably before nightfall, is close this off with some sort of detectable barricade to prevent pedestrians just from getting into this area, period. They are setting up an alternate access route, you can see here, but a few details trouble me. Notice it looks like there's a bike rack in the alternate access route. So if there's a bike parked there, there may not be sufficient width. Or notice the drinking fountain here may make it difficult for someone in a wheelchair maybe to get lined up with that opening. And then here you have nearby also that a grate, like a tree grate with very large openings that a wheelchair wheel could drop into. So there's a number of concerns here with this setup. And then the final part of the PAR that we'll talk about are curb ramps. Curb ramps do present a conundrum. They are a cue for pedestrians who are blind. They're a detectable edge. So curbs are a good thing for blind pedestrians. But as we've talked about, curbs are a barrier for individuals in wheelchairs. And so to remove that barrier, we install curb ramps at the corner and other locations to allow individuals in wheelchairs to move between the sidewalk and the street. But at the base of the curb ramp, of course, the curb is missing. So if a blind pedestrian got lined up with the curb ramp, they could enter the street without realizing it because there's no curb. They rely on the curb to tell them when they've reached the end of the block. So that's why we use the detectable warning surface, the truncated domes at the base of curb ramps. As the slide says, it's a replacement cue to tell the visually impaired that they have reached the street. And here you see kind of the schematic setup for a curb ramp. Down here at the bottom is the street running from left to right. This is the sidewalk, so pedestrians will be walking left to right here. This larger rectangle in kind of the center of the image, that's the curb ramp. The grayish area is the detectable warning at the base of the ramp. There's a landing at the top of the ramp to allow for turning. And since this ramp is in a pedestrian circulation path is from back of curb to back of sidewalk. So this ramp is within that pedestrian circulation path. Able-bodied pedestrians can walk across here. We need to have flared sides. It's not explicitly shown here, but this landing by definition would be level, meaning no more than 2.1% cross slope. So the PAR, the pedestrian access route here, is actually up here. This would be the PAR, and we'd say the PAR is contained within the pedestrian circulation path. And I've talked about the detectable warnings, the truncated domes. They need to provide visual contrast for the low vision pedestrians, but also tactile detectability for the blind pedestrian and for low vision pedestrians. So notice this surface is designed to be detected by the cane, but low vision pedestrians generally do not use a cane, so it's also designed to be detected underfoot. So when a low vision pedestrian steps on that surface, they can tell that they have reached the street. They're about to cross the street. But these are not used for wayfinding. They're strictly a warning device. And the rule is use them everywhere the curb is missing at a street crossing. They're kind of like a stop sign for the visually impaired. When a blind or low vision pedestrian encounters the truncated domes, they know they're about to enter the street, and so they need to check out the situation. And the way they would check it out, since they can't see, is they would listen for maybe the APS sounds at a signalized intersection, or if there is no signal or no APS, they would listen for traffic sounds, the sounds of moving traffic. Curb ramp grade, PROWAG says maximum grade 7.5%. I should have mentioned when we talked about cross slope, there is no allowance for construction tolerance. So if your contractor or if your construction crews say the best we can do, say for a sidewalk cross slope is plus or minus 0.5%, then we should be designing for, say, 1.5%. Same way with curb ramps, 8.3% is the maximum. A number of municipalities design them for 7.5%, so that when they're built, the ramp won't exceed 8.3%. And when you're chasing grade, the running slope length need not exceed 15 feet, but the slope must be uniform. Something else to consider is the change of grade or counter slope at the gutter. You can see an abrupt change of grade here, and going from the ramp to the street can cause the footrests of this manual chair to bottom out. Or down here, this individual's going from the street to the sidewalk, go up the curb ramp. There is a potential, if that change of grade is too great, that the wheelchair could actually tip over. Curb ramp width, PROWAG minimum is 4 feet, of course, but my advice would be to make the curb ramp the full width of the sidewalk. Or actually, if you have a shared use path that crosses a road or street, PROWAG requires that the curb ramp be the full width of the shared use path. Turning space or landing. The final rule calls it landing. Minimum 4 foot by 4 foot turning space needs to be provided at the top of the curb ramp. And these can overlap where one landing can serve 2 ramps. When that turning space is constrained, the best practice would, meaning there's a curb, say at the back of the sidewalk, the best practice is to use a 60-inch turning space, but the requirement is 48 by 48, the minimum. But I'm sharing with you here the best practice if that turning space is constrained. And at shared use paths, the landing needs to be as wide as the shared use path. PROWAG also addresses the landings at perpendicular and parallel curb ramps. And you all can read that. I won't read each individual item there. Same way with parallel curb ramps. But the key thing is the cross slope of landings, 2.1% maximum. I mentioned flared sides earlier. PROWAG says flared sides with a slope of 10% maximum measured parallel to the curb shall be provided where a pedestrian circulation path crosses the curb ramp. So as I said earlier, if that ramp is in the pedestrian circulation path where pedestrians might walk across it at right angles like that, we need to have flared sides. But if the ramp is not in a pedestrian circulation path like you see here, notice the ramp is in the grass strip, then we can use vertical curb returns. We don't have to have flared sides. But this is what not to do. I took this over the Christmas holidays. I was traveling. Looks like a relatively new sidewalk and curb ramp construction. Notice though, there is no detectable warning surface, so that's a major omission there. But notice the pedestrian circulation path is from the back of curb to this little retaining wall, I guess, at the back of sidewalk. So this curb ramp is in the pedestrian circulation path, but yet they should have used flared sides, but they have vertical curb returns. And what concerns me is this is a real serious trip and fall potential at these situations. Pedestrians don't expect that drop in elevation there. And so I'm concerned this agency may be exposed to tort liability claims where people trip and fall and are injured. Curb ramp surfaces. The best practice is to make curb ramp surfaces smooth. Texture makes them hard to climb. The ramp here on the left, this complies with PROWAG. PROWAG doesn't really say anything about the surface of ramps, but the best practice would be to do what you see here on the right. Notice the ramp and the landing have a smooth surface, so it's easier to go up the ramp, easier to turn on the landing, and so the better design would be shown on the right, although I want to emphasize both of those comply with PROWAG. There are three types of sidewalk to street transitions. There's two types of curb ramps, perpendicular and parallel, and then something called the blended transition. Perpendicular ramps have a running slope that cuts through or is built up to the curb at right angles, meets the gutter, grade break at right angles, has a minimum 4 foot by 4 foot turning space at the top of the ramp. And if the ramp is in the pedestrian circulation path, we have flared sides. I think I showed this image earlier. Here you see two perpendicular curb ramps at a corner, and they share the same landing. It is important that curb ramps intersect the curb at right angles so that both wheels of the wheelchair enter or leave the ramp at the same time, like you see on the left side there. The ramp on the right, I would call that a skewed ramp. We should not be building those. Notice one wheel's on the ramp, one wheel's in the gutter. And actually, if we look closely, we would see that this wheel here that I'm circling is off the ground. And remember, with a manual wheelchair, all four wheels should always be on the ground. We don't want a chair off the ground as it affects the stability of the wheelchair. Parallel curb ramps, you see the sidewalk ramps down and the landing is lower than the sidewalk. And again, this needs to be a minimum 4 foot by 4 foot turning space. But given this little retaining wall or curb at the back here, the best practice would be to make this a 5 foot wide sidewalk or 5 feet from the back of curb to the back of sidewalk. And this is the only design where the detectable warning surface is part of the landing. So those are the two types of curb ramps, parallel and perpendicular. The third type of sidewalk to street transition is what's called the blended transition. And you'll notice the curb is missing all around the corner. So we need detectable warning surface. And the running slope is 5% maximum. And the final rule emphasizes that we need what they call a bypass at the top. And the bypass is simply a level area, because if you think about it, not all pedestrians will want to cross the street here. Some pedestrians will just want to go around the corner or go around the corner like this. And so they need to have a level landing, if you will, to do that turning. And at a blended transition, that level area is called the bypass. So here the bypass is this kind of lighter gray area that you see. Notice in my mention of 3 types of sidewalk to street transitions, I have not mentioned the single curb ramp or the diagonal curb ramp. And that's because under PROWAG, these are unacceptable in new construction. We should not be building any more new single diagonal ramps. They may be okay for alterations if it's technically infeasible to use one of the other 3 types. And the main reason for this is that the curb ramp needs to land within the crosswalk that it serves. And as you can see from the photo here, notice with diagonal ramps, that's not the case. This individual in the wheelchair has to leave the protection of the crosswalk to get lined up with the ramp. And in fact, traffic is coming from his back where he can't keep an eye on it. That's very disconcerting. Detectable warning placement should be at the back of curb or at the grade break. And I mentioned earlier, there is the requirement for visual contrast. So yellow on light concrete, that does satisfy the visual contrast requirement. Gray on gray concrete does not. Probably best contrast would be black on light concrete, but we've learned from experience that guide dogs and people with certain types of macular degeneration perceive the black mat as a hole in the sidewalk and will actually walk around it. So it's not prohibited by PROWAG, but my advice would be to avoid using black. Use another color rather than black. Quality control is important. There's no allowance for construction tolerance, so measuring widths, grades, and slopes is critical. Be sure you measure them, don't eyeball it, and use the proper tools for slopes and grades. I recommend a steel tape and a 2-foot and 6-inch levels for making your measurements. A 6-inch comes in handy, say in the gutter pan or the top of curb and that sort of thing. But we do need to pay attention to quality control. So that was a quick overview of the PAR. I'll maybe take a couple minutes here if anyone has any questions on the PAR.
Thanks, Ron. We had a question from Don. He says, quote, if any crosswalks are upgraded with the ADA ramps, are we required by law to put in a device for the visually impaired as well? End quote.
Oh, great question. And the answer is no. That's one of the gray areas of PROWAG. To me, a key thing would be if you can do it, kind of try to get the ramp, lined in the proper direction, but I realize that may not be possible. There is some discussion now. In fact, I was at, just a week ago, I was at a workshop at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting in Washington on what are called tactile indicators. And there is a device under development that would be placed at the ramps to help the visually impaired get lined up. But that is still being researched, and right now there are no requirements for that. There may be down the road in the future, but right now there are no requirements for that. But great question.
Thanks, Ron. Question from Leonard. He says, quote, what is the permissible difference between a curb ramp and pavement elevation? When a curb ramp slopes down and transitions to meet the pavement, shall it be flush or within a maximum tolerance? End quote.
Yeah, desirably flush. The maximum tolerance would be the same as for changes in level that we talked about, which would be a 1/4 inch vertical would be the maximum allowable lip.
Thanks, Ron. Those are all the questions at this time.
Okay, great. Let's keep moving then, and let's talk about approaches to routing pedestrians. And remember, first and foremost, in my opinion, the main consideration for all pedestrians is safety. And safety is not the same as accessibility. Just because something is accessible does not necessarily mean it's safe. It's still up to us as transportation professionals to use our training, our experience, our knowledge to provide safety as well as accessibility. Now let's look at the MUTCD. You can see here the MUTCD talks about working in a way that doesn't create a need to detour pedestrians from existing routes. They note that extra distance and additional street crossings add complexity to a trip and increase exposure to the risk of accidents. Sections 6C.03 and 6N.04, which I just cited, require alternate pedestrian access routes to be detectable and include accessibility features consistent with the features present in the existing pedestrian facility. So when we're talking about accommodating pedestrians, I would consider the type of work that's being performed. What's the duration of that work? What sort of hazards and impediments will that work create for pedestrians? I showed you this image earlier. Probably the work crews here were just going to be there for a few hours, or even less than that. So I would, before work started, determine how pedestrians might be affected by that work activity. I think we mentioned that earlier. In this case, for one thing, we have to warn pedestrians of this opening, the open manhole, but also we have to let pedestrians know the available route is, let's say that's to the north maybe, is on the north side of this sidewalk for all pedestrians. So we have to let pedestrians know that. Establish a plan for how crew members will assist any pedestrians in negotiating that work zone. And then identify somebody to watch out for pedestrians and initiate the plan if the need arises. But many work zones are left in place, of course, over multiple days or even weeks. And there's not going to be workers present at all times. So we're going to need more extensive efforts to accommodate pedestrians. And that's what we'll talk about now. There's three approaches. We can maintain existing pedestrian pathways if the sidewalk can remain open during construction. Maybe it's narrowed or something like that, but we can maybe use the existing pedestrian pathway. That's what we should strive for, if possible. But if we can't do that, then develop an alternative pathway that's parallel to or easily reached from the current pathway, if that current pathway is closed. For example, maybe there's on-street parking on the street. Can we detour pedestrians to what had been the parking lane and have them in the street for some distance? If the existing pedestrian path must be closed, identify and develop an alternate pathway in advance of the temporary traffic control that will detour pedestrians around. In some cases, we have to detour them across the street. MUTCD mentions that's not always desirable, but in some cases that may have to be our detour. So we have to develop a plan to get pedestrians across the street and then back to the original side of the street. If the current pathway can remain safely open to all users, the MUTCD states that temporary facilities must include accessibility features consistent with features present in the existing pedestrian facility. MUTCD also recommends don't lead pedestrians into conflicts with vehicles, equipment, or operations. You have that detectable edge so pedestrians can, visually impaired pedestrians can find their way and not sort of accidentally get into an area maybe where materials are stored or equipment's moving, that sort of thing. Don't lead pedestrians into conflicts with vehicles moving through or around the work site. And provide pedestrians with convenient and accessible path that replicates as nearly as practical the most desirable characteristics of the existing facility. In addition, in terms of safety, make sure we Protect pedestrians from like trenches or holes adjacent to the path. Again, have detectable edges to help guide the visually impaired, keep them on the path and away from those potential safety issues. Make sure good sight lines are maintained for pedestrians and drivers at intersections, and that may relate to signage or material storage or parked vehicles or whatever, but make sure good sight lines are provided at intersections. And then don't forget, make sure access to transit stops and businesses is provided. Any questions up to this point?
Thanks, Ron. We have a question from Jared. He says, quote, regarding ramps aligning at a right angle to the curb line, is this a PROWAG requirement or best practice? PROWAG appears to show the skewed alignment, and he references R304.2.3.
That would be the best practice. It's not a requirement. I think PROWAG recognizes the various sorts of situations we may get in the built environment and in the natural terrain. So it would be a best practice, but not a requirement.
Thanks, Ron. Question from William. For city arterials where new walks and drive aprons are being relocated on one side of the street, how can you move pedestrian traffic to the other side of the street? Is there, not sure the phrasing of what he's saying, but he's saying, how can you move the pedestrian traffic to the other side of the street?
Is this as part of like a temporary traffic control area?
It's not specified.
If it's I'd be glad to address offline if you have more specifics you'd want to provide. I'd be glad to take a look at it and offer my thoughts. But if it's kind of what I'm thinking, a typical arterial, and I don't know what the block lengths are and that sort of thing, but it seems maybe you'd want to have the pedestrians cross at the intersections rather than try to do some sort of mid-block crossing, unless the block lengths are very long. That's why I think I want to take a look at it in more details.
Yeah, sorry, Ron. William has added, if there are no sidewalks on the other side.
So would this be a detour type situation? Or you're just saying generally get them to the other side of the street?
Yeah, I guess it's not clear, so yeah, maybe we can follow up with an email or something like that. Next question from Eric. He says, can you speak to max running slope for a new construction, separate alignment, specifically a shared use path in places with difficult terrain?
Would you mind reading that again, Mike?
Sure. Yep. Question from Eric. Can you speak to max running slope for a new construction, separate alignment, specifically a shared use path in places with difficult terrain?
Yeah, the 5% would be the maximum grade under PROWAG. Coming from West Virginia, I appreciate your difficult terrain does certainly present some constraints and may affect what you can do. But I would say what we should strive for is the 5% maximum there.
Thanks, Ron. Question from Amy. Does the 2% cross slope for a PAR apply to the crosswalk area of the road where a road profile is greater than 2%?
The answer there is it depends. We didn't get into it in this session, but PROWAG does have specific cross slope requirements for ramps and for crosswalks, for perpendicular ramps, and it's actually a function of the traffic control on the roadway approach. And if Mike will allow, I'll put in a plug. I think it's 2 weeks from this week. I'm not sure they've publicized it yet, but I will be teaching virtually the Designing Pedestrian Facilities for Accessibility class. And actually, we will get into the details there of the cross slope requirements at crosswalks at intersections.
Thanks, Ron. Question from Michael. Are counterslope concerns a reason why raised crosswalks should extend across the entire width of the street?
I would say that's one important reason, yes.
All right. We have no additional questions at the moment, and we have reached 11:30. So thanks, everyone, for your participation this morning.
Mike,
And,
can you interrupt? I have one comment. I think I promised to answer a question that came up earlier today.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I thought we were going to talk about it today, but this morning, but we will talk about that this afternoon. That is part of my presentation. So I don't want whoever asked the question to think I was ignoring the question. We will talk about that after lunch.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ron. As a reminder to our audience, we will have part 2 of today's webinar series this afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And we want to mention also that you will have a new link to join the afternoon session. So please refer to your email that's specifically for the 1 p.m. session today. So thanks again, and we'll see you then.
Yeah, thanks everyone. See you then.